Christmas Eve in Savannah, 1845. The streets glimmered faintly under the pale wash of moonlight, each rooftop crowned with frost, each window glowing with the soft burn of candlelight. The city pulsed with song. From taverns to chapels, carols floated into the night air, carried on the smoke of pine and oak burning in crowded hearths. It was a night meant for peace, for warmth, for gathering around tables heavy with roasted meats and wine. The air itself seemed to ring with cheer. But beyond those polished doors in the deep woods and shadowed fields of the plantations, the night was far from holy. For those bound in chains, Christmas was no gift. It was another day of service, another night of silence. Behind the laughter of masters rose the unseen weight of obedience demanded from the enslaved, tired hands cracked from cold, still pressing on to prepare feasts they would never taste. Among them was Rosa. She stood that night apart from the rest, not bent over a table or a fire, but still, watching. Her breath cut pale clouds in the air. Her hands, hardened by years of labor, twitched as though the cold had sunk too deep into the bone. Her eyes, fixed on the house, held a quietness that was not submission. There was something unmovable behind them, something that did not flicker with the flames. Inside, the house swelled with noise. Boots scraped against wood floors. Glasses clinked, spilling wine that bled into the grain of the table. The voices of her master and his brothers tumbled into drunken laughter, their songs slurred, hymns turned mocking. The smell of roasted goose and sugared brandy seeped through the cracks of the walls, clinging to Rosa's clothes, though she was never invited to the table. The contrast was stark. Outside, the bitter sting of December wind, sharp as knives, against the skin. Inside, firelight and warmth, a false paradise built on the backs of those who would never share in it. Rosa stood between these two worlds, bound to one, yet no longer belonging to either. She was not the ghost they believed her to be. She was not the servant they imagined would bow endlessly. In her chest, something had hardened over years of cruelty, humiliation, and unspoken grief. Tonight, that weight was no longer a burden. It was a decision. There are moments in history when silence bends into something unrecognizable, when the obedience of the oppressed transforms into a sound no hymn can drown. Tonight, beneath the hum of carols and the crackle of hearths, another rhythm stirred. It was low, steady, inevitable, a rhythm like the toll of a funeral bell. And by dawn, the carols of Savannah would not be remembered for their joy. They would be remembered for the screams that replaced them. Rosa's story did not begin on that Christmas Eve. It began years earlier, in soil and smoke, beneath the heavy drapery of Spanish moss that clung to the trees around Savannah. From her first breath, her path had been carved by others. Her name, chosen without thought, was a mark of possession. Her earliest memories were not of play or freedom, but of labor. Tiny hands reaching into rows of weeds, bare feet pressed into clay that burned in summer and froze stiff in winter. Childhood was no sanctuary, it was another word for survival. The plantation was her world, and it was a world built to suffocate. Each day unfolded with the rhythm of cruelty. The smell of damp earth mixed with sweat and blood, the sharp sting of a lash cracking through humid air, the rattle of chains clattering when someone faltered. Cicadas screamed in the heat, their relentless chorus only broken by the sharper sound of punishment. Nights offered little relief. The air grew heavy, thick with smoke from hearth fires, the groans of bodies aching from endless toil, and the muffled cries of those who endured too much. Her master was a man who wore arrogance like armor, and his three brothers were no different. Together, they moved through the plantation like predators, their laughter cold, their tempers quick, their dominance absolute. They treated cruelty as entertainment, turning pain into ritual. A meal was often accompanied by threats, a toast punctuated by a slap or worse. Their footsteps on the wooden floors of the house carried a rhythm everyone learned to fear. When their boots struck the earth outside, even the dogs fell silent. And yet Rosa endured. There was a quiet strength in her, a defiance that did not burn openly but glowed like a coal hidden beneath ash. She found fragments of dignity where none should have existed, a stolen moment under the oak trees where the air was sweet with dew, a whispered prayer in the dark that no whip could silence, the rhythm of her own breath reminding her that she was still alive, still her own in ways they could never fully possess. To live was to resist, even if resistance was invisible. But endurance is not infinite. By the winter of 1845, the landscape itself seemed to mirror the tension rising within her. The mornings came bitter and sharp, breath freezing on cracked lips. The fields turned stiff, the soil brittle, the wind slicing through worn clothes that offered little warmth. Work did not lessen with the cold. It only changed form. Fires still had to be tended, timber chopped, food prepared for men who feasted, as if the world owed them abundance. Savannah glittered that season. In the city streets, merchants hung wreaths of pine, shop windows filled with candles, and churches swelled with song. But on the plantations, the same bitter silence lingered, the same cruelty repeated without pause. For the enslaved, the season meant exhaustion dressed in ribbons, servitude wrapped in false celebration. And Rosa, watching the house rise in noise and light, felt the cold settle differently within her. It was not just the sting of winter air, it was the chill of something final, a stillness in her chest that had nothing to do with frost. She had lived her entire life bound by their rules, their violence, their hunger. She had been their servant, their shadow, their possession. But history has a way of bending beneath the weight of a single soul who refuses to remain silent. Rosa was nearing that bend. And though the world around her carried on with songs and laughter, there was already a fracture beneath the sound, a silence between moments, a tension threading itself through each nightfall. But the quiet would not last. The weeks before Christmas tightened around Rosa like a noose. Each day brought fresh bruises, some visible, others buried deeper where no eye could see. Words could cut sharper than any whip, and her master and his brothers wielded them freely, mocking her silence, twisting her obedience into entertainment. Even when the sting of the lash faded, their voices lingered, echoing long into the night. In the cramped quarters where she slept, the air pressed heavy with the smell of candle smoke and damp wood. Every breath carried the taste of ash, every cough rattled through lungs already raw from winter's chill. On nights when sleep refused her, she would bite down hard enough to taste iron on her tongue, pressing it there as though pain could anchor her to something solid. But even pain was fleeting. What lasted was the dull, constant ache of endurance. By December, something in Rosa shifted. Not loudly, not in a way anyone could see, but in silence. It was in the way she held her back straighter when her master shouted, in the way her eyes no longer dropped to the floor when one of the brothers laughed too close to her ear. She carried her anger like a hidden ember, glowing low, invisible until the right breath of wind would set it ablaze. That ember found its shape one night in the tool shed. The air there smelled of pitch and old wood, a bitter scent that clung to the hands. Rosa's fingers closed around the handle of an axe. The blade was dull from use, its edge chipped, but its weight was steady, certain. She lifted it once, testing, feeling the balance in her palms. In that moment there was no fear, only a strange calm, as though the decision had been waiting for her longer than she had realized. She set it back against the wall, but the memory of its weight lingered long after. The days moved quickly after that. The brothers grew restless with anticipation for the holiday, their voices louder, their demands harsher, their arrogance swelling like the river after rain. Rosa moved among them as she always had, clearing their plates, stoking their fires, bearing their orders without a word. To them, she was still invisible. But in her mind, their every careless gesture became a thread in the net drawing tighter around them. Christmas Eve arrived with bells tolling faintly in the city, their sound carrying across the fields like distant warnings. In the big house, the brothers gathered around the long oak table, their laughter booming, glasses raised high. Wine spilled across the polished wood, dripping like blood down the edges. Their songs, slurred and coarse, echoed through the hall. Hymns of joy turned into jeers. The air was thick with the smell of roasted goose, sweet spice and burning pine. The fire popped loudly in the hearth, sparks leaping up like startled birds. Shadows flickered across the walls, stretching long, bending with each movement. Rosa stood at the edge of it all unseen, her silence deeper than the noise. How much weight can one spirit bear before it finally breaks? That is the question history often forces us to ask. For Rosa, the answer was not measured in days or years, but in a single night. She slipped away when the room swelled with drunken voices, unnoticed as boots stomped in rhythm to a clumsy carol. In the dark shed the axe waited, its handle worn smooth from years of labor, its blade catching a sliver of firelight through the crack in the wall. Rosa's hands did not tremble when she reached for it this time. She lifted it with the certainty of someone who has already crossed the line between thought and action. Back in the house, the brothers sang on, their voices breaking into laughter, careless, unguarded. Rosa stepped quietly, each footfall steady, the axe hidden against her body. The bells in the distance marked the hour, ringing hollow and cold across the night. And by the time the final note faded, the silence between sound and action had vanished. The ember inside Rosa had become fire. But the night had not yet revealed how it would burn. Midnight had settled heavy upon the house, thick as smoke. The last of the candles burned low, their wicks bending, their flames guttering with every draft that slipped through the cracks. Shadows stretched tall across the paneled walls, grotesque shapes swaying with the firelight, as if the house itself leaned in to watch. The air reeked of roasted meat, sour drink, and pine dragged in from the cold woods outside. Chairs creaked under the weight of drunken men. Their laughter broke unevenly, the edges frayed by exhaustion and liquor. Rosa moved, among them like silence given form. She poured, she cleared, she bent her head at the right times. Not one of them looked too closely. Why would they? She was a shadow to them, a tool, a body without a name. Her steps measured, her eyes low. She walked to the corner where the shed's axe leaned against the wall. The handle felt rough, almost, splintered in her hands, but steady. She lifted it, slow as breath. For a heartbeat, the weight of it rested across her palms, not yet raised, not yet revealed. The fire cracked louder, as though the world braced itself for what was coming. The first strike fell without warning. A sharp crack split the air, louder than any song, sharper than any word. Wood and bone gave way together. The sound echoed in the rafters, in the hollow of men's throats as their laughter collapsed into gasps. One of the brothers staggered, eyes wide, mouth opening to scream. But only a wet sound escaped. Blood spilled fast, dark and gleaming, rolling across polished oak boards. The metallic scent filled the room in an instant, sharp on the tongue clinging to the back of the throat. For a moment, the house held its breath. The fire hissed low, the shadows stood still. Then the chaos came. Boots scuffed and slipped across, the blood-slicked floor. Chairs overturned, crashing into one another. Voices rose, breaking, snarling, choking. Another brother lunged for the hearth poker, but his hand slipped on his own wine. Rosa's arm swung again, and the axe met him, clean. The crack of splitting bone mixed with the splinter of wood. His cry turned to a gurgle that was swallowed by the fire's hiss. She did not pause. Her arms moved with a rhythm born not of frenzy but of certainty. Each strike cut through years of silence, each swing a reply to every bruise, every insult. Her face remained calm, almost serene. No rage twisted her mouth, no wildness clouded her eyes. She looked as though she had rehearsed this moment her entire life, as though the axe were an extension of her breath. The third brother stumbled back, crashing into the long table. Glass shattered, spilling sour wine across the floor, mixing with blood until the scent became unbearable, sweet, metallic, choking. He tried to crawl, dragging himself on shaking arms, but Rosa followed. The axe rose, fell, and the noise of his struggle ended in a single final crack. The last one, the youngest, pressed himself against the far wall, his voice high, broken with terror. "Rosa, wait," he stammered. But the words held no power. His knees knocked against the floor as he tried to stand, his hands clawing for balance. Outside, faint through the frosted glass, carols rose from the distant town. Voices sang hymns of peace and salvation, their melody cruel against the slaughter inside. He looked toward that sound as though it might save him. But no hand reached for him from beyond. Rosa's shadow fell over him. The axe came down. The fire popped once more, spitting sparks onto the rug. Silence swelled in the room, deeper than before, heavier than the smoke. The four brothers lay scattered, their blood weaving dark rivers that soaked into the boards, staining the wood forever. The smell clung to everything: metal, pine, sour drink, burnt fat. The echoes of their last cries still seemed to linger, trapped in the rafters like ghosts who could not yet escape. Rosa stood among them, her breath steady, her hands wet but unwavering. The axe rested at her side, its blade dark, dripping. Her eyes did not dart or tremble. She gazed at the fire as though listening for something only she could hear. Perhaps it was silence, or perhaps it was the faint trace of music, drifting in from the outside world, unbroken, unknowing. She had crossed the line between thought and deed, and there was no going back. But she did not look back. The night outside pressed against the windows, thick and endless. Somewhere, far across the fields, bells rang the hour. Midnight. True and final. The carols carried on, their voices rising, blind to the blood that soaked the house on the hill. By the time the fire dimmed low, the brothers who once laughed loud enough to shake the walls lay still. No sound remained but the hiss of dying embers, the faint whistle of wind through the shutters, and the quiet, steady breath of Rosa, who had remade the night with her own hands. And as the shadows shifted once more, it was clear. The house was hers now, though not in any way the world would recognize. The story was only just beginning. The last strike had fallen and the house collapsed into silence. Not the silence of peace, but of something ruptured beyond repair. The air itself seemed to recoil, pressing against the walls, pressing into Rosa's chest. The fire hissed, spitting, weak sparks, its glow bending low over the room. Blood seeped into the cracks of the oak floorboards, filling the air with a heavy iron tang that clung to the tongue. Smoke from the hearth curled upward, carrying with it the faint smell of scorched pine and wet wool. No voices, no laughter. Only the faint, steady rhythm of Rosa's breathing. Her hands shook, but the axe did not slip. Her body trembled, but her stance remained fixed. Calm and trembling lived inside her at once, a contradiction she did not try to resolve. Her eyes lingered on the fire, not the bodies around her. For the first time, the brothers were truly silent. For the first time, she was not. Beyond the windows, the night seemed unaware. The fields stretched dark and frozen, holding their secrets close. Yet the quiet did not last. Whispers stirred in the quarters, voices hushed but urgent. A door creaked, feet padded quickly over dirt, carrying the story forward before dawn could break. "Something has happened," they said. "Something impossible." The tale spread, like flame. It reached the nearest cabins, then slipped across fields to the neighbors' ears. Men startled from sleep, women clutching children close, all drawn by the soundless terror that moved faster than words. They looked toward the great house, its windows glowing faint with dying fire, and they felt the dread before they knew its cause. Could it be true? Could one woman bring an entire house down with her own hands? Inside, Rosa waited. She did not flee into the night, did not try to hide what she had done. She stood where the last body had fallen, the axe resting against her, side, her breath steady as stone. Her gaze lifted once toward the rafters as though listening for a sound only she could hear. Then she lowered her eyes and stayed. It did not take long. Dogs barked first, a jagged noise tearing through the cold air. Then the voices followed, sharp and rising, torches cutting wide swaths of light across the frozen ground. The night filled, with the crunch of boots, the clatter of iron, the wild shouts of men calling her name, though they had never once spoken it with respect. The silence was broken. The door burst open. Smoke, blood, and the stench of death rushed out to meet them. Torches flared against the walls, painting the room in red and gold. They expected madness, wild eyes, frantic movement, a woman broken by what she had done. But Rosa stood tall, her figure unmoving in the midst of ruin. The axe was still in her hand, its blade slick, but her grip loose, as though it had already served its purpose. The men faltered at the sight. Even the dogs whimpered, uneasy in the thick air. 4 bodies lay sprawled in grotesque stillness, faces unrecognizable, blood soaking deep into wood. The house, once roaring with drunken song, was now a tomb, and in the center the woman they had overlooked for years now commanded the room without a word. Some stepped back, others shouted, though their voices cracked. Still, Rosa's eyes did not waver. There was no hysteria, no pleading, no terror. What they found was colder, resolve carved deep into her expression, as permanent as the blood at her feet. Outside, the carols had ended. Only the wind moved now, sweeping through the fields, carrying the story farther still. The night, once full of celebration, now belonged to her. And as the torches closed in, Rosa did not move. Rosa did not vanish quietly into history. The men who stormed that blood-soaked room dragged her into the night, torches shaking, dogs straining against their leashes. She offered no struggle, no plea. Her silence unsettled them more than screams ever could. By dawn, her hands were bound in iron, her fate already sealed in the whispers that spread faster than truth. Some say there was a trial, brief and hollow, the verdict decided before the first word was spoken. Others claim no court bothered with her at all, that her sentence was carried out beneath the same oaks where countless others had met their end. The rope was rough, the air sharp with winter, frost. When the crowd gathered, they expected fear. What they saw instead was the same stillness she had carried into the house on Christmas Eve. To the masters of Savannah, her name became a warning. Her story was retold at supper tables, in hushed tones around fireplaces, a tale meant to remind their children cruelty could be answered. Even the most obedient shadow might one day step forward holding an axe. To the enslaved, she became something different. They spoke her name softly, almost reverently, not as a ghost of fear, but as a flicker of defiance. Mothers told it to their children as both a caution and a secret kind of prayer. That silence, even under the weight of chains, could one day split open into action. The house where it happened did not last. Wood rots, stones crumble, and fire consumes. But stories cling longer than walls. Savannah's Christmas Eve carried her mark, a stain in the memory of the city. Blood on Holy Night. Was it vengeance or was it justice? Even now the question lingers. Some claim that when the bells toll on December nights, if you walk the older streets, you might hear more than carols carried on the wind. A muffled crack, like wood splitting. A cry cut short, the hush of silence so heavy it presses against your skin. Others say the story is nothing but legend, a Gothic tale woven to frighten or inspire. Yet legend has its own kind of truth. Rosa's act ended, her life but not her presence. She became part of Savannah's darker hymn, a verse sung not in churches but in whispers between those who knew what it meant to endure. Her vengeance was brief, but her memory eternal. And in that silence where history tries to look away, her name remains. So I ask you, when the carols fade, when the candles gutter low, do you believe the echoes of that Christmas Eve are still out there? Or does Rosa only live in the stories we dare to tell?